Welcome. I'm Ian Shapiro, Director of YCIS, and I'm delighted to welcome not only everybody in this room here today, but the folks in the two overflow rooms upstairs, which I'm told are also full, who will be watching our proceedings on video. Before our proceedings get underway, let me just take this opportunity to invite everybody who's here to join us for a reception afterwards on the second floor in the lounge area to continue what I think is going to be a very interesting conversation that we're about to start. So welcome all. We're delighted today to be the hosts of Nicholas Kristof as the speaker for the 13th Coca-Cola World Fund Lecture at Yale. The lecture was established in 1992 to support endeavors among specialists in the intersection between international relations, international law, and the management of international enterprises and organizations. And it's hard for me to think of somebody better qualified to speak at those three intersections than our present guest. YCIS sponsors this event along with the Law School and the School of Management. Mr. Kristof, as you all know, is an op-ed columnist at the New York Times. He graduated from a university to the north of here in 1981 and then won his first-class honors in his study of law at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. He later studied Arabic in Cairo and Chinese in Taipei. He's lived on 4 continents, reported on 6, and has traveled in well over 100 countries. Mr. Kristof joined the New York Times in October of 1984, initially covering economics. After that, he served as a business correspondent based in Los Angeles, as Hong Kong bureau chief, as Beijing bureau chief, and as Tokyo bureau chief for the Times. In 2000, he covered the presidential campaign, and in particular, then Governor Bush, and he's the author of the chapter on Mr. Bush in the reference book on the presidents. In 1990, Mr. Kristof and his wife, Cheryl Wudun, also a Times journalist, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. They were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer for journalism. Mr. Pulitzer has won other prizes, including the George Polk Award and the Overseas Press Club Awards. Mr. Kristof and Ms. Wudun are the authors of China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, and Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia. The title that Mr. Kristof has chosen for today's lecture is The First Genocide of the 21st Century, reporting from Darfur. I'm very pleased to introduce Nicholas Kristof.
Well, thanks very much. As a Harvard graduate, it always gives me great pleasure to come to one of the 2 best universities in the country, although we may not agree on exactly how we would draw that hierarchy. And also, I just heard a moment ago that Yale actually today announced that it was divesting itself of stocks that has something to do with Darfur. So the timing is particularly apropos. And I'm also particularly glad that the context here that what we're talking about is genocide today, because I think there's often a tendency to speak about genocide as something in the past and then to recite the mantra of never again, but to define again so narrowly that it would only apply to a German National Socialist named Hitler trying to come to power. And in fact, of course, the best way to honor the victims of past genocides isn't just to build museums or memorials or invite journalists to talk, but more broadly to try to prevent the next genocide from happening. And raising awareness of Darfur and learning more about it is surely one of the first steps toward that, although also, I hope, not the last. Well, let me try to place this a little bit in a historical context. In 1915, Armenians were being slaughtered, and Woodrow Wilson, with absolute determination, looked the other way. Then in the Holocaust, of course, FDR refused pleas to bomb rail lines leading to Auschwitz. Something similar happened in Bosnia and in Rwanda. Famously, the Clinton administration refused to even use the word genocide because it was afraid if it did, then it might actually have to do something. And today, President Bush, for his part, just about doesn't let that word Darfur past his lips. So, in effect, we have a long and bipartisan and consistent record on genocide of inhumanity. Well, I first went to Darfur just about 2 years ago, almost exactly. And I didn't know what to expect. I arrived from the Chad side of the border, and on the Chad-Sudan border, I found thousands of people who all told pretty much the same story. They'd been driven from their villages by Sudanese government aircraft attacking those villages, and then by a Janjaweed militia opening fire with machine guns, burning huts, often with people still inside. And these people, these refugees whom I spoke to, were hiding out from the Janjaweed, which was still periodically attacking them, but mostly the Janjaweed was staying by the wells, because this is an arid area, largely desert, with few sources of water. And so the Janjaweed militia members were staying by the wells, and when men would show up to get water, they were shooting them. When women were showing up to get water, they were raping them. And what struck me more than anything else was the moral choices that these refugees were forced to make. And in particular, they were sending their very small children, their 8-year-old kids, their 10-year-old kids, for miles across the desert with donkeys to get water from the wells, because often the Janjaweed wouldn't bother the youngest children. And it seemed just appalling for any parent to send their kid to face a danger like that, and yet, I realized that if I were in that situation, I'd be doing exactly the same thing, that they had no choice. Well, that image, kept haunting me, and as a columnist, it seemed I should be gallivanting around other parts of the world, preferably, Europe, but I couldn't get some of those images out of my mind, and so I went back a few months later, and I went hundreds of miles further to the north, to an oasis in the far western part of Darfur. This time I found about 30,000 people, and they had nothing, and they were all sheltered under trees in this oasis, kind of one family under each tree. And I went tree to tree and just started talking to people about their experiences. Well, under the first tree, I talked to two brothers. One had been shot in the neck and in the jaw. His jaw had essentially been shot off. He'd been left for dead. His brother had been just shot in the foot and had managed to run away, and that night came back to the village to go through the bodies, found his brother still alive, carried him back on his back for 49 days, traveling only at night, to get to this oasis, and the hope that he would be able to get treatment for his brother. Under the tree right next to that one, there was a woman whose parents had been shot in her village, and then the bodies stuffed in the well to poison it, which is routine in these village attacks. Then she had been in hiding in the hills, and the Janjaweed had found her family and had killed her husband and the other male members of her extended family. Under the third tree, there were two small children, a 4-year-old girl carrying her year-old baby brother on her back. Their parents had been murdered, so they were orphans. And under the fourth tree, there was a woman whose husband had been killed, her 2 young children, the youngest just a baby, both killed, and then she and her 2 sisters had been kidnapped and gang raped. Her 2 sisters had both been killed. She had been stabbed on the leg to be effectively mutilated to stigmatize her forever as a victim of rape, and then left naked to go back to the rest of the community to add to the terror there. And what maybe overwhelmed me more than anything else was, those were the first 4 trees that I went to. And everywhere, in every direction, as far as I could see, there were more trees and more families and more people who had stories just like that. And it was kind of at that moment that the scale of what was going on really hit me. Well, sometimes I think the total number of people who have been killed in Darfur is, by international standards, somewhat modest. We really have no idea what the death toll has been, but a few 100,000 is probably as good a guess as any. And that's within the margin of error for the number of deaths every year from malaria, for example. And so, there are moments when I think, should we really be that focused on Darfur as opposed to malaria and AIDS and all these other things that kill so many more people? But, I'll tell you, in the course of a career as a foreign correspondent, I've seen an awful lot of really awful things, whether violent or kids dying of these diseases, but somehow there is nothing that affects me or I think other people more powerfully than a government deciding on a policy to choose people on the basis of ethnicity or skin color and to get rid of them. And I think it's because it seems like such a breach of humanity, of the bonds of humanity, of the fabric of humanity, that it seems particularly repulsive, and in turn creates some kind of particular obligation on us to assert our own humanity by responding. Well, let me back up and give a little bit of the background of how this happened in Darfur, in a place that we'd never heard of, a couple of years ago. There has historically been tension in the area among the peoples there. It's an area that is marginalized. It never has gotten adequate attention or resources from the central government in Khartoum. And the division there tends to be threefold. At one level, it's between Arab tribes and non-Arab tribes. And there, the distinction is essentially that an Arab is somebody whose mother tongue is Arabic and the others speak a tribal language and often also speak Arabic. But there has been some intermarriage. In particular, there are 3 non-Arab tribes, the Fur, the Masalit, and the Segawa. So that's the first cleavage in the region. The second is indeed racial. In general, the Arab tribes tend to be somewhat lighter skinned than these African tribes. And the third is the division that you see all over the world between herdsmen and settled farmers. In general, the Arab tribes tend to be nomadic herdsmen, and the members of these African tribes tend to be settled farmers. And those create their own clashes. And in particular, the spread of the Sahara Desert and shortage of resources has led to more clashes over water, grass, and this kind of thing. So you had a real headache for the government in Darfur of competing groups. But the government in Khartoum is, it's an Arab government, and it completely supported the Arab tribes in Darfur, who steadily became more and more abusive and brutal to the non-Arab tribes. And finally, in the beginning of 2003, the non-Arab tribes staged an incipient rebellion. And at that point, the Sudanese government, in effect, went completely nuts. They decided, I think that, the Sudanese authorities are not Taliban-style nuts. They're really pragmatic, calculating people, and I think that they figured that the simplest way of dealing with this rebellion in the middle of nowhere was to completely depopulate the rural areas of these tribes that were supporting the rebellion. And they figured it was in a remote area, nobody would really pay a huge amount of attention to it, and they would solve this problem once and for all. They chose as the leader of this Janjaweed militia a man called Musa Hilal, and he doesn't mince words. He was quoted in a recent book about Darfur as having expressed gratitude, and I quote, "for the necessary weapons and ammunition to exterminate the African tribes in Darfur," unquote. Well, these days, you travel through Darfur, and it is just eerie and scary. You go for mile after mile after mile, and you just see burned out villages, one after the other. And the villages consist of these circular mud huts. And the mud, of course, doesn't burn, so those mud foundations are still standing. The thatch roofs have been burned. You know, people have fled in chaos, and so their possessions sort of strewn around here or there. So as I'm driving through these areas, you know, it's a little bit nerve-wracking. If somebody sees me, their first instinct is to flee in the other direction. My first instinct when I see somebody else is to flee in the other direction. And so interviews become a little bit difficult. But there are a lot of people still living in these areas, these no man's lands, who are not getting any kind of aid and are completely being hunted down by the Janjaweed. We have very little idea of what is going on in large areas of Darfur that aid workers and the African Union cannot reach. Now, the government claims that the fighting in Darfur, that what is happening essentially is just tribal warfare. And the State Department, our State Department, has unfortunately used some of that same language. And, you know, there is an element of truth there. There is genuine tribal conflict. But to describe what is going on as just tribal warfare is, you know, completely misses the point of the way the Sudanese government has armed the Janjaweed and given them this mandate to kill. On my last visit, my most recent visit to Darfur in November, I was driving along a road coming back from a massacre site where the Janjaweed had slaughtered a whole bunch of villagers. And I was on a road where there were, indeed, a bunch of Sudanese government soldiers. And indeed, one of those soldiers had kind of forced his way into my vehicle. Well, as we're driving along, we see and pass a convoy of the Janjaweed, these same thugs who had just been busy murdering villagers. Well, the soldiers, neither the one in my car or the ones at checkpoints all along the road, they had no interest in the Janjaweed because, of course, they're all cooperating. But meanwhile, at one checkpoint, my vehicle was stopped, and the secret police tried to arrest my Sudanese interpreter. They pulled him out of the car, pulled him in an interrogation hut, and told me, we're just going to hold him for investigation. You go on, nothing to do with you. Well, you know, it was pretty clear that their investigation of him was going to end up with him being dead pretty soon. So, of course, I refused to go. They then decided, well, that meant I should be detained as well. Later, they called a higher commander, and we were both released. But it was so clear that if the Sudanese government just applied the same restrictions to the Janjaweed that it applies to foreign journalists, no, this genocide would be over in a moment. This is completely happening with the collaboration, with the mandate of the Sudanese government. Well, is this genocide? There's been some argument that it shouldn't qualify as genocide because there's no determined effort to exterminate every last member of these African tribes, the Fur, the Segawa, and the Masa. And that is, it's basically true that the Sudanese authorities are not trying to exterminate every single member of these tribes. There's a reasonably determined effort to kill men and, say, teenage boys. With others, if people run away, then, sometimes they're killed, sometimes they're not. But it's not as if there's a fanatical effort to destroy absolutely everybody. And because of the Holocaust, we tend to think of genocide as something that is an attempt to exterminate everybody. But in fact, if you look at the 1948 Genocide Convention, which defines genocide as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, unquote, then that's exactly what's going on in Darfur. The Genocide Convention doesn't require any effort to destroy every last member of an ethnic group. And likewise, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide, that certainly wasn't his intention either. It's somewhat broader than that. And by any legal definition, it seems to me what's unfolding in Darfur is absolutely genocide. Well, what have we done about it? We've been pretty good about supplying relief aid. The U.S. in particular has led the way in that, and particularly for people who manage to escape to Chad, and more than 200,000 people have. Then if they get there, if they get to a refugee camp there, then we will supply medical care to patch them up. We'll supply food. We'll supply tents. We'll help them. Even people who are who manage to get to these large camps for internally displaced people within Sudan itself, then we've been good about supplying food and pushing for more humanitarian access to those people. What we have not been good about at all is providing either security to stop this or just standing up to this and calling it what it is. And one of the lessons of past genocides is that this is something that governments are not proud of, that they try to hide. It unfolds in secret, and that if you shine some kind of a spotlight on it, then indeed it tends to subside. And we saw it, when in the period of Darfur, that when it got a lot of international attention, and Colin Powell visited, and Kofi Annan visited, and people were focused on it, then the level of killings did decline. And then when the tsunami hit in Asia, then all the attention immediately swiveled around away from Darfur, and the level of killings in Darfur immediately ratcheted upward again. And more broadly, this kind of humanitarian relief, while it's great as far as it goes, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are alive today because we did provide that, but it still feels just incredibly deeply unsatisfying when you travel around Darfur. One woman aid worker told me a story that has always haunted me. She was working in an area where the Janjaweed were still active, still around. And she visited a village with the permission of the Janjaweed, and they had a little assessment mission, and so they called together the villagers and kind of asked, had a public meeting and asked how everything is. And of course everybody said, oh, things are okay. And it was obvious to her that this was not the case. So she managed to get two Fur tribeswomen, two sisters, apart, and with her interpreter asked them, so what's happening? And they said that in their household, the Janjaweed had shown up, had taken over their house, and had effectively turned their family into servants of the Janjaweed. And so they had to go and get food and cook the food for about 12 of the Janjaweed. And these two sisters had to sleep with the Janjaweed. And finally, after about 2 weeks of this, the father of the two girls, he finally couldn't put up with it anymore, and he found the commander of these men in the house, and he went to the commander and just begged him, please, just let my daughters leave this village. Please let them go. And the Janjaweed commander at that point brought the two sisters in to the same room and then beheaded the father in front of them. And what this aid worker said was, this is an area that I can reach. This is an area where the international community is still active, and these kinds of things are still happening. And that it's great to provide relief, but unless you also stand up to the atrocities, then it seems so woefully insufficient. Well, why don't we do more? I think there are a lot of reasons. I think that one problem is that, frankly, it's not before us. This is happening in a remote area. It's not on our television screens. And I think that television, more than anything else, would make a huge difference in rallying some kind of international response. And the Sudanese government has been very clever about keeping journalists generally out of the area. Some of you may know that I've launched a campaign to sponsor Bill O'Reilly, to send him to Darfur to try to get more coverage. That was partly tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely. I mean, it would make so much difference if somebody like him went there. But I don't just want to pick on him. I mean, television in general has completely dropped the ball. CBS Evening News last year devoted 2 minutes over the course of the entire year to covering Darfur. And in contrast, for example, the 3 broadcast networks each averaged 28 minutes to covering the Michael Jackson trial. I can't tell you, when the Michael Jackson trial was happening, I just wish that there could have been a change of venue to Darfur, so that finally it could have gotten some attention. Or when the runaway bride case, if that runaway bride had only shown up in Darfur, then the networks would have figured out a way of getting there, and it would have gotten some coverage. But frankly, it's a historic problem. In general, we in the news media haven't done a good job. And my own paper, the New York Times, during the Holocaust, we published 24,000 front-page stories. Of those, guess how many were related to, referred on the front-page part to attacks on Jews by the Nazis? 6. 6 out of 24,000. So genocide is something that historically we haven't particularly distinguished ourselves in covering. I say the press has done a somewhat better job in Darfur, the written press has. What we really need more of is photos and above all television. That would make a huge difference. I think that at some level there's also a sense for the lack of political response here, is that it's hard for Americans to identify with people in Darfur. And part of that is skin color. I think that if people in Darfur looked more like average Americans, then I think that middle America might rise up a little more, care about it more. But I think there's also at some level just a sense that, here we are in the world's only superpower. We're sophisticated. We have this sort of, very highbrow moral sense, and that Africa's always a mess. These tribes are always fighting. It's too bad, but they're so different from us. And that argument is not usually framed quite so openly, but I think that is widespread, and that just burns me up more than anything when I travel in Darfur. On one of my visits, I visited a little village called Unsatisfying, and spoke to a woman whose 2-year-old child had been pulled from her arms and beaten to death in front of her. And she had escaped to this place called Unsatisfying, and she had another child there. And this is a place in the middle of nowhere. The Janjaweed is running around. The Sudanese military is running around. It's completely unsafe. And she's asking me, so what do I do? Should I try to set out for Kalma camp in hopes I can get there and there are international aid workers there? Or do I, do I stay here? And what will the rest of the world do? Or, is the rest of the world ever going to help us? And, so what am I supposed to tell her? That, we in the West don't really want to help you because, frankly, we're morally superior and you're, a bit depraved. It so flies in the face of everything you see there. Gandhi was asked at one point what he thought of Western civilization. And as you may know, he remarked, he thought for a little bit and said, I think it would be a good idea. And, at times like that, in places like Kasra, I think it would be just so important and would make such a difference. Well, why is President Bush not speaking up more firmly about Darfur? It's interesting because this issue is not one that is intuitively on the left or on the right. And in fact, it was really the right who initially noticed what was happening in Darfur because evangelicals in particular had been very attuned to Sudan because for years Christians in the south of Sudan had been slaughtered, and it was evangelical Christians who were jumping up and down about that. And so they were among the first to notice when violence began to break out in Darfur. And people in Bush's Agency for International Development, AID, were calling for the White House to do something long before the Democrats ever noticed. But the White House has never managed to get its act together on this, to do anything much about it. I think there are three reasons. And I think that if President Bush were here and were trying to explain his passivity, I think he would, and the cameras were out, I think he would make three arguments. I think first he would say that the most important thing we've done in Sudan was to end the North-South civil war there, which is completely different from the Darfur fighting. And that North-South civil war killed 2 million people over 20 years. And indeed, to his credit, President Bush really did manage, by using political capital, because it was something he cared about, he did manage to bring a tentative peace there. And more power to him for that. And I think that he's concerned that if we put too much pressure on the Sudanese government, that will in turn jeopardize the North-South deal. Well, I think that is completely wrong. And indeed, I think at this point, the administration increasingly acknowledges it, that in fact, Darfur is threatening to unravel the North-South deal. And you can't have a successful deal between the North and the South when you've got genocide going on in the west of Sudan. That just doesn't fly. The second argument that I think he would make is that the priority of the administration has to be fighting terrorism, and that Sudan has indeed been provided a lot of cooperation in providing intelligence about terrorism and in cooperating in stopping terror financing. And I think that's largely true. That's an important thing we have to worry about. But it can't be the only thing. And for example, we brought, the U.S. Brought the head of Sudan's intelligence organization, Saleh Ghosh, to Washington by private plane for consultations about terror. And that's great, but he's also, as much as anybody, the architect of the genocide in Darfur, of all of these atrocities I've been talking about. And you can't conduct business as usual with people like Saleh Ghosh just because of one item on the agenda. And the third reason I think that the Bush administration has not been more active is this sense that it's a mess, it's hopeless, that there aren't good solutions. It's easy for a journalist to jump up and down about it, but the policies really are hard. And that was basically the same reason that Clinton didn't want to do more about Rwanda. It's the reason presidents historically have been so passive on genocide. And at some level, they're right. It is a hard problem. I don't know if some of you may have read Samantha Power's brilliant book about history of genocide. It's titled A Problem from Hell. And it is. In every case, it happens in a remote area in governments we have very little leverage over. But I think that that's giving up way too early. Now, the North-South deal in Sudan, that really was a hard problem. The South wanted independence. There was significant amounts of oil involved. In Darfur, on the other hand, it seems to me a peace accord is much easier to achieve. The rebels in Darfur don't want independence. They want greater autonomy. They want more power sharing. The distance between them is something that we can help overcome. And in particular, we often manage to send signals that are just incomprehensible. At the end of last year, we took out $50 million from a conference report for spending to help fund the African Union forces in Darfur. And there's no better way we could have sent a message all over the world that we don't really care about this than to take out the funding for these African Union peacekeepers who can't even take flights around because they're running out of helicopter fuel, because their radios aren't working. You know, providing that $50 million in funding should have been an absolute no-brainer. And there are all kinds of little things that the Bush administration can do, and you know, one of them is simply speaking up. If President Bush were to bring some survivors of the genocide to the White House to meet with them and to speak to television reporters, that would help put it on the agenda internationally. And instead, when aid groups have tried to bring survivors to this country to get them out there, the U.S. has made it very, very difficult for them to get visas. There have been photos taken of atrocities all around Darfur, and those are sitting in locked file cabinets. And indeed, there's one young American named Brian Steidel who was out there as an advisor to the African Union, and he got so fed up with this that he leaked a bunch of these just horrifying photos of 2-year-old kids with their faces bashed in with Kalashnikov butts. And he released them, and then the State Department threatened to sue him for releasing these photos. I mean, they should have been celebrating his action. I think that, you know, at some level, the government will respond only when the public does. And after the Rwandan genocide, Senator Paul Simon, the late Senator Paul Simon, said that, you know, if just 100 people in every congressional district had written to the member of Congress and said, we got to do something about Rwanda, then that would have changed the political calculus, and Americans would have responded. And I think that's largely true today, that, you know, there's no constituency out there that is calling members of Congress and saying, you know, please don't do anything on genocide in Darfur. And there's no countervailing pressure. It's just a matter of getting enough to push the White House and members of Congress to do a little bit more. And so, you know, if you want to know what to do, then I think the most useful thing is simply to make noise and to bellow. And once there is a certain level of outrage, then politicians will follow and will determine policies that will make a real difference. And simply that level of scrutiny and concern and alarm makes a real difference on the ground. I mean, here at Yale, there's a organization called STAND, which is active in Darfur issues. They're holding a letter writing campaign later, I think a vigil. There's information outside. And there are lots of other groups. There's SaveDarfur.org, there's Genocide Intervention Network. They're all, and any aid group is active there. If you need a push, then let me just leave you with a story of a woman I met last summer in a camp called Kalma. This is a woman called Magbula, and she was from a little town. She was quite prosperous, and then all of a sudden one day the Janjaweed attacked her village, and the Sudanese Air Force attacked her village, and her family they weren't able to take anything with them, but they escaped safely. And they hid in the hills. Then, a couple of months after that, the Janjaweed found the family in hiding. They caught them, they held them at gunpoint. They killed Magbula's husband in front of her, tormented her, 8 of the men gang raped her. Her only concern was, how do I keep my children alive? And her thought was, if I can just get through this, then I can take my kids to a camp where there will be international aid workers. And her smallest child was just an infant, very, very young. So when these men left her, she set out across the desert with her children, this long odyssey. She finally got to Kalma camp, which is the biggest camp probably in all of Africa at this point. But the Sudanese government at that point was refusing to accept new arrivals, and so refused to register her, and so she couldn't get food distributions, she couldn't get help in building a hut, or anything else. She was just sleeping out there in the sand. And a few days after she made it to Kalma, and finally, in the embrace of the international community, aid workers there, then her youngest baby died. So think of Magbula. Think of about 2 million more people like her who have been displaced, and they're the people whose lives we hold in our hands. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to take questions.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Is there a religious dimension to the conflict that the Sudanese government is one religion and the people in Darfur are another religion, and that's causing political strife?
My guess is that people in other rooms can't hear the question, right?
Right.
Okay, let me repeat that. The question was whether there is a religious element to the strife in Darfur between the government and others. And in this case, there is not. There was in the North-South conflict, where the north of Sudan is Muslim and the south is either Christian or animist. So that was very much an element of the North-South conflict. In Darfur, everybody is Muslim, and so that has not been an element of it. One of the things that I just can't understand is why other Muslim countries in the region haven't spoken up more about Darfur. It would make a huge difference if Egypt, for example, which has huge influence in Darfur, would speak up about it, if the Arab news media would raise it more. I think that one of the problems has been that in the aftermath of Iraq in particular, that anything that is raised in the US immediately attracts so much suspicion that it kind of lacks it doesn't have a lot of credibility, and I think that has been, frankly, one of the problems in getting other Muslim countries to raise issues of Darfur.
Do you think there's any prospect of getting NATO involved?
The question is whether there's any prospect of getting NATO involved. I hope so. It's right now most people in at least NATO would say no, and people in the US government would generally say no. But what's happening on the ground is that we have an African Union force, 7,000 peacekeepers, only 5,000 of them actually with weapons, and the weapons they have are AK-47s. They're hopelessly outgunned. The Janjaweed have heavy machine guns on the backs of pickup trucks that fire 3 times as far as these little AK-47s that the peacekeepers have. Some of the Janjaweed even have artillery. The AU force, it was great that it went out there, but it's way too small, it's outgunned, it's been a failure. That's maybe a little strong because there'd be a lot more people dead if it weren't for them, but it certainly has not stopped the tragedy. What everybody is now kind of agrees has to happen is that force has to be blue-hatted. In other words, it has to become a UN force. And the idea is that that the African Union peacekeepers would stay there, and then you would bring in others to make it a much larger force under the auspices of the UN. There is general agreement on that, but it's kind of agreement that, well, in about a year, we'll have a UN force there, and in the meantime, not much will change. I think it would make tremendous sense to have a NATO force there as a bridging force, in between the two. And I think if the U.S. were to really push for that, I think it would happen. I should say that I don't think that it makes sense to send U.S. ground troops into Darfur. Again, in the aftermath of Iraq, I think that would arouse just tremendous hostility and suspicion around the Arab world. I think the Sudanese leaders would be able to say, those American imperialists are launching a new crusade against the Arab motherland, rise up and defend the motherland. And so I think that would be a mistake. But I think that you can have a very robust international force with Muslim troops from Turkey, for example, with troops and equipment from Russia, ideally from Japan, Canada, Germany. It'd be great if China sent some to bring China into that. China has been one of the great protectors of Sudan in this, playing a totally disgraceful role. But NATO would make NATO could do this. It'd make a great difference if they were to. I sure hope it'll happen as a bridging force, but I sure wouldn't bet on it.
What is the president of Slovenia doing, and how can we help him?
The question is, what is the president of Slovenia doing, and how can we help him? Well, it's amazing to watch the politics of Darfur, and my reporting usually goes, where I talk to somebody in one government or in one administration, and they describe how much they're doing and how little everybody else is doing, and everybody is passing the buck. And in this absolute vacuum of leadership, the president of Slovenia, of all places, has emerged as a real leader, and everybody else is kind of contemptuous of this effort. I mean, Slovenia, but I take my hat off to him. Slovenia, if Slovenia wants to be interested in this and wants to talk about these issues, and the president of Slovenia, whose name I can't pronounce because he desperately needs more vowels, but he's been, he came to New York to meet Kofi Annan. He wanted to meet President Bush. President Bush did not want to meet with him. And again, what a lost opportunity. I could have just met, uttered the word Darfur, invited them in for, the press in for a photo op. But he's also, the president of Slovenia has also got, some celebrities involved in this little quixotic campaign. He's planning a trip to Darfur, and he's offering to take television cameras with him, which is very useful because it's very difficult for us to get visas into Sudan. And so we can either try to accompany some official and get a visa that way, or we can sneak in illegally from Chad. And there are problems with both options, but that ability to bring people in is great. And I don't know why our government and other leaders, why they're sort of contemptuous about the president of Slovenia doing this when we should be celebrating him and inviting him to Washington to talk about how we can bring other Europeans in and so on.
Let me interject my own question. One thing you didn't talk about was any kind of international legal remedies. And a year ago we had a lecture here from the chief prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and he gave a pretty harrowing account of how under-resourced they are, and that they can really only pursue, one or two.
Actually, when you speak in the mic.
Yeah, that they really can only pursue one or two cases at a time, and they really try to pick them to be as strategically efficacious as they possibly can. But this seems like such an obvious candidate for them, and I wondered if you'd had any either thoughts about or interaction with the ICC and the prosecutor's office, and what might be going on there.
Sure. I'm a great admirer of Luis Ocampo, the prosecutor, but I'm I'm actually much less, I mean, in general, I'm kind of the, multilateralist, always wringing my hands over some kind of issue that we should all be, talking about. Actually, the ICC I'm less enthusiastic about than I think a lot of other people of similar ilk, and for basically two reasons. One is that, if resources are scarce and you can apply the marginal $50 million to trying to keep people alive in Darfur, say, as opposed to providing accountability afterward, then I think that if that is the trade-off, and it's not a perfect trade-off, but there's something to it, then I think relief should be a higher priority. And secondly, I think that accountability does provide some deterrence sometimes, but typically the danger for a Janjaweed leader in a place like Darfur or Liberia, Sierra Leone, and so on, is that you're going to be, shot tomorrow, as opposed to ending up before an ICC tribunal in a few years. So I'm somewhat skeptical of the advantages, and the other downside is that it can complicate a resolution of a problem. And in northern Uganda, for example, that once you actually are trying to prosecute somebody, then it's harder to reach a peace treaty with them if they think they're going to be facing prosecution, for example. So when I approached the issue with a certain amount of skepticism about the ICC, but in this case, I thought that it was useful to refer, for the Security Council to refer the prosecution of war crimes in Darfur to the ICC, and that's basically because it's one thing we can do to bring a little more attention to atrocities there, to genocide there, and in the absence of any other effective measures, it does help put it on the international agenda to some degree. It did get Sudan's attention. Sudanese leaders are genuinely scared about that. So Luis Ocampo is proceeding full speed ahead with his investigation, and more power to him.
Can you talk a bit about the domestic political situation in Sudan? Do people in regions outside of Darfur know what's going on? Do they care what's going on? Are there elements in the military or the government that are conflicted about the Khartoum's policy towards the region of Darfur?
The question was about domestic Sudanese politics and whether people in other parts of Sudan know about or particularly care about victims of atrocities in Darfur. And the answer is generally kind of they don't know much or care much. In the north, in the Arab parts of Sudan, there's a natural tendency to identify with the Arabs in Darfur. And it is genuinely true. They often complain that the news media and international figures always talk about the atrocities suffered by the African tribes and never about the atrocities suffered by the Arab tribes. And indeed, there are some, but there is a certain lack of quality there. I mean, there were, I'm sure there were some SS men killed by Jews in Europe, but trying to create some kind of parallel there, I think, is is kind of absurd. And that's the situation that the African tribes, some of them have harmed some Arab tribes, but few and much less than the other way around. In the south, we were, and also I should say that the Sudanese news media is so controlled that there isn't really any effective reporting, either by foreign media or domestic media about what is going on in Darfur. In the south of Sudan, we were really hopeful that after this tentative peace agreement between North and South, that once you brought Southerners into the government, that then they were going to put pressure on the government to reach a deal over Darfur. And they have not been nearly as helpful as we had hoped or thought. I think part of that is because they are mostly Christian or animist, and they don't particularly identify with Muslims who are getting killed in Darfur. They have their own problems, which are enormous. That agreement may fall apart. So it's hard for them to get excited when they've lost 2 million people of their own, about a few 100,000 who have been dead so far in Darfur. And so the bottom line, unfortunately, is very little sympathy internally in Sudan. The one exception, which is interesting, is the armed forces. That disproportionately, the Sudanese military is composed of African tribespeople from Darfur, members of the Fur tribe, the Segawa tribe, and so on. And that indeed is one reason why the Sudanese government decided to resolve this not by using its own armed forces, but by using the Janjaweed, that it wasn't sure that it could rely on Fur soldiers to slaughter Fur villagers. Who knows if there's any unrest in the Sudanese armed forces? We'll know it when there's a mutiny somewhere. But I would not bet on that.
Yes, ma'am.
I know that the SLA, the Sudan Liberation Army, is very limited in its capabilities. A lot of them are just farmers and herders. But do you think because of their personal interest they have the capacity, like the RPF or anyone in genocide, can they coordinate their efforts in such a way? And is there any realistic means through which the
They-
West can help them?
The question is whether the Sudanese rebels, the rebels in Darfur, the Darfur rebels, whether they could play a role analogous to that of the rebels in Rwanda, who, in the context of that genocide, ended up ending the genocide by taking power, or whether there's a realistic rebel force in Darfur that we could help and empower in that way. And I'm afraid there isn't. The rebels have behaved atrociously on their part. Their leaders have been mostly sitting in Abuja. The peace talks have been in Abuja in Nigeria, and both sides have been sitting in these nice hotel suites, enjoying a life there and getting nowhere and not really negotiating seriously. Over the last 6 months or so, the rebels have been fracturing themselves and often shooting each other, spending more time doing that than actually taking on the Janjaweed. So I have very little hope for the rebel forces, and they're real thugs too, a lot of them. I was struck in one time when I sneaked in from Chad. I drove into a rebel outpost, to a village that was guarded by some rebels, and the commander, he warned me, "You've gotta give us a call on our sat phone if you're going to be driving around here, because when we see something moving, we tend to shoot it." Those are supposed to be the good guys. Well, I don't think that there is a realistic process there that we can provide military or other support to. There are tribal sheikhs in Darfur, both Arab sheikhs and non-Arab sheikhs. And these guys, they don't have the guns, but they have tremendous moral authority and legitimacy in the context of Darfur. And right now, the peace process, I think, has largely ignored them. That effectively, these international talks have involved the government, Sudanese government, and then the rebels. And those are the two most recalcitrant parties. And I don't think we're going to get a peace agreement out of them. I think, though, that, my ideal scenario on that front would be that Kofi Annan would appoint Colin Powell as a special envoy. Colin Powell, I think, really cares about Darfur. At the end of his time there, he didn't early on, but toward the end of his time as Secretary of State, he really began to care about Darfur. That if he would go out there and pretty much bypass the Sudanese government and the rebels and talk to the tribal sheikhs, then there is a traditional conciliation mechanism in these villages, because people have always been stealing each other's camels and sheep, and there are ways of resolving those. And it seems to me quite plausible that that kind of foreign intermediated talk would actually get somewhere. The sheikhs on both sides are sick of what's going on. Obviously, the sheikhs of the African tribes have had their people being slaughtered. They're living in camps. They want to have this behind them. And the Arab sheikhs, their migration patterns have been have been hugely disrupted. And while they stole vast amounts of livestock, they kind of depended on markets that were operated by these African tribesmen and on crops that were raised by people in the African tribes. So their livelihoods have been hugely affected too. And I think that the Arab tribes would be willing to work toward some kind of a peace too, as long as you could just bypass the Sudanese government and the rebels. And you know, would that work? I don't know, but it's surely worth a try.
What effect is this genocide in Darfur having on the stability of Chad itself? And I'm not just saying having 200,000 refugees where they can't cope with them, but the rebels have always come to Chad from
Right.
Darfur. What is happening?
The question was, what impact is the Darfur unrest having on Chad next door, just to the west? And that is, that's a great question. It's one that is very fuzzy, but one thing that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention is that it seems, as far as we can tell, that Sudan is about to sponsor an invasion of Chad using basically a proxy army. The present president of Chad, President Deby, was installed by Sudan years ago. And traditionally, that's what happens, that Sudan, you get this rebel force in Sudan will kind of support it, and then it'll race across the desert to the capital of Chad, N'Djamena, and then take charge. And the problem, even though President Deby was installed by Sudan, he is a member of the Segawa tribe, and the Segawa tribe is one of those being slaughtered in Darfur. So he hasn't been entirely supportive of that, and Sudan has been he's been standing up a little bit more, and so finally Sudan's been getting sick of him. And so there is a large force of, and they're nominally Chadians. In theory, these are Chadians who fled Chad and are mounting, a rebel force. I'm sure an awful lot of them are Sudanese. The tribes are on both sides of the border. It's hard to tell who's what. They're very well equipped. Somebody who was there recently told me they had 2,000 jeeps, jeeps and technicals, these pickup trucks with heavy machine guns on the back. They're maybe an hour's drive from the Chad border. They say that they're going to invade Chad and overthrow President Deby, and I would take them at their word. I think that I think it's very likely, more likely than not, that in the next couple of months that we will see them attack Chad, and possibly, in the best case scenario, they will surgically overthrow President Deby, and there'll be a little Anschluss between Sudan and Chad will be, and I'll never get another visa to Chad again, I guess. But then the fear is that then the international community won't get access to these 200,000 plus refugees on the Chad side. But it could be a lot worse than that. The Chad Civil War could reignite. The people in these refugee camps on the Chad side could be, completely slaughtered. The Janjaweed of the last month or so is making daily raids across the border from Sudan into Chad. And essentially the whole international community just hasn't wanted to deal with this, or with the prospect of Chad being, in effect, swallowed up, made another client state again of Sudan. But it seems to me just a reflection of the degree to which our policy and the whole world's policy toward Sudan has failed. That after all that they're willing to mount an invasion, a proxy invasion of a neighboring state.
On that note, given French interests in Chad, do you think that there's any hope that that kind of proxy war against Chad could, maybe be a step too far and provoke a reaction by the Foreign Legion in Darfur?
The question was whether the French have real interests and traditional interests and major base in Chad, not far from the Sudanese border. And would in a proxy invasion of Chad by Sudan, would that get the French to stand up and maybe use a foreign legion? I don't think so. The French have been really wimpish on Darfur and pretty unhelpful. And I'm not so sure exactly why, but they have, of the Europeans, of the Europeans, the Russians have played the most disgraceful role. The French, come in second on that front. It would make a lot of sense if the French air base in eastern Chad and Abéché were used to impose a no-fly zone over Darfur. They're horrified at that idea, and I don't think that they would, blink if this invasion force came waltzing through.
What sort of relief efforts are still active in Darfur and Chad, and what's the nature of their activities?
The question was about what kind of relief efforts are active in Darfur itself and in Chad. In general, they're overseen by the UN, and all the aid agencies are active. I mean, in a town like Niala in South Darfur, you go down the road and one compound after another is, it's Save the Children, it's CARE, it's International Rescue Committee, there's a new restaurant in Niala catering, Westerners never used to go to Niala, but there's now a new restaurant catering to the aid workers, to this invasion of aid workers in Niala. It serves actually pretty good pizza, and since it's basically the only restaurant in Niala, on my last time there, I walked over and I counted about $750,000 worth of SUVs parked outside. And, I didn't know what to think about that. I mean, in a place where people are just dying because they can't get anything, it just seems like an incredibly strange use of resources. On the other hand, these aid workers who were in Darfur, I mean, they are risking their lives every day. It's a nasty area. They're getting harassed. Every time they leave Niala, those roads are dangerous places. They're getting shot at. So it's hard to begrudge them, a nice $60,000 SUV. But something is still wrong in that kind of allocation of resources. But it's effectively all the aid groups are active in both Darfur and Chad. The problem is security. That there are large areas now that are no-go areas where you get either Janjaweed or bandits, and then aid workers can't go. And indeed, I mean, one of the things that people talk about, I mean, a little bit hush-hush. I hope there's no Sudanese intelligence official here to send this idea back. It's one reason why I haven't mentioned it at the column. But one of the real fears is that the government of Sudan will decide that all these foreigners in Darfur are just too much of a headache. They're complaining too much. And the simplest way of getting rid of them is you machine gun some of these people out in the middle of nowhere on one of these roads. And then it's not obviously, the Sudanese government won't obviously have their fingerprints on it. They'll blame it on bandits. But then in that kind of situation, aid workers will have to be pulled out. And if that were to happen, the UN estimated that 100,000 people a month would die in Darfur. And, I think there have been times when there have been hints that that is happening, when there have been attacks on compounds, on aid agency compounds in some of the towns, when there have been attacks on convoys, and even a USAID employee, a young woman, was shot in the face last year. So there have been some of these incidents. They're scary, and I just sure hope that it doesn't come to that kind of attack that would just drive away all the foreigners.
What is the population of the African tribes? In other words, what would the death toll be if the Janjaweed took the Nazi-like efficiency approach?
The question is, what is the population of these tribes? And if the Janjaweed did take a Nazi approach to things, then what kind of death toll would it be? Again, we don't know an awful lot of things about Darfur, including good population figures. The estimates tend to be maybe 6 million people in Darfur, and the majority, and maybe as many as 2/3, members of these African tribes, and and less than half, and maybe 1/3, various Arab tribes. And there are some tribes that are hard to place. There's one of the largest Arab tribes, the Baggara Arabs, have not been involved at all. In fact, they've sheltered some of the non-African tribes. And also, people in the cities have, in general, even if they're from African tribes, they've in general not been targeted. It's really people in either rural areas or in these camps who are most at risk. And indeed, even in the areas that the Janjaweed has completely controlled, they found it useful to have farmers, to let some people survive so that they can have farmers farming, so they can have some markets. And so it's, if things go very badly, it won't be, all, say, 4 million non-Arabs being killed in Darfur. But I suppose, you could certainly have a death toll of a total of 1 million or more dying in Darfur alone. If it spreads into Chad, another 1 million or so. One of the reasons we know so little about what is going on, and there have been some interviews with people who tried to calculate death toll for Darfur. It's deeply unsatisfying. One of the things, though, that just gets me every time I go through one of the camps, either in Chad or in Darfur proper, is you look at the camp population, and there are not a lot of males. It's overwhelmingly women and children, or old people. And some women and children are getting killed, but it certainly is overwhelmingly men who are being killed. And I think the reason, by and large, that you're not seeing them in the camps is that they're dead.
I think we have time for 3 more questions. Yeah.
You speak of 3 tribes. Do they work together?
The question was about these 3 tribes in Darfur. Do they work together? And the tribes, the Fur, the Masalit, and the Segawa, initially they did to some degree. And there are some tensions among them as well. But initially, when they were being wiped out, they really did cooperate. But over the last year or so, they've been splintering, and in particular, the Fur and the Segawa tribes have been splintering along in the rebel force along tribal lines, and so they've been shooting and torturing each other, and it's added to the whole mess of Darfur. I think that the Sudanese government has made some kind of calculation at this point. That's how it's going to put this behind it, that the rebels are just going to collapse and be defeated militarily, and that then it will, completely control the whole area, and that these areas of rural Darfur essentially will, they will never be repopulated. And there have been real efforts to destroy infrastructure, poison the wells, as I mentioned, destroy irrigation programs, destroy schools, in a way that, you get the sense that there's real effort to completely change the ethnicity of the area.
Given that the Janjaweed is so well armed now and on such a roll, as it were, if the Sudanese government is finally shamed and pressured into stopping, is that actually going to change what's going on?
The question is, given that the fact that the Janjaweed are so well armed, and if even if one were to shame the Sudanese government, would that really change the facts on the ground? And it's a fascinating question. I mean, there is a real, the Janjaweed are really full of themselves now. Their feeling is, the Sudanese government, the Sudanese army couldn't tackle the rebels, couldn't tackle the problems in Darfur, so they called on us, and, we did it. And militarily, they're very well equipped. They've, rocket launchers, artillery, every gun you can imagine. And this is in an incredibly inhospitable area, and it's hard for a conventional army to fight in. And so I think that if the Sudanese government were just to try to crack down on the Janjaweed just like that, it would have something of a fight on its hands. But the saving grace of this is that Darfur is deeply tribal, and there are sheikhs, and the sheikh they do command loyalty of everybody below them. So if you can convince the leading sheikh that that they need to stop the slaughter, then that word does filter out, and that's what effectively needs to happen. And I think that it indeed can happen. You get rid of a couple of the sheikh, like Musa Hilal, the guy who I quoted earlier, and put somebody else in his place. And the Sudanese government has been doing that kind of manipulation of the tribes. To me, the last best hope in Darfur is those sheikh on both sides.
Yeah. You talked a lot about the victims of the atrocities. Have you had any sort of personal contact with the Janjaweed? Do they go back to their wives and children after raping these women and killing these men? Do they have jobs? What is motivating them besides these sort of vague historical factors?
The question was about the Janjaweed, and what kind of people are they, whether I've had contact with them, and do they, after going out and slaughtering people in a village, do they just go back to their families? I've had somewhat limited contact with them, thank goodness. It's really it's really scary sometimes, because you're out there, and one time some local tribes people, they pointed out a camp in the distance, and they said, that's a Janjaweed camp. And I thought about driving over and hi, I'm from the New York Times, but it just didn't seem like a great idea. And but I have had some contact here and there, especially in the cities, and you get a sense of a couple of different things, that there is an element within the Janjaweed, and particularly in the leadership, that is really pathological. These are people who had long histories of murdering people, often because of their ethnicity. They'd been involved in massacring people they didn't like. One of the ways that they staffed the Janjaweed early on, when they were forming it, was by opening up the prisons and bringing out thugs, completely antisocial people. And then I think is one reason why you get some of the most brutal kinds of actions. It's very often you get kids tossed onto bonfires, for example. You get a lot of mutilations. And I think that is coming from this real pathological kind of thuggery. And then you also get a lot of these Arab tribes people, and they are much more nuanced, and when you talk to them, they say, that these people have been, building their farms, they've been taking our water, we've been here forever, and then they've been, planting their crops, and it gets in the way when we move our livestock around. When there's a drought, we can't get enough water for our livestock, and then they'll always cite some example of their camels being stolen by, those poor villagers, and they're all crooks, and this kind of thing. But they're embarrassed by the degree of killing, and you get the sense that it's kind of a mob scene, and that a lot of those people that they could return to a kind of more normal life and put it behind them, and that Darfur could, start over with kind of that segment of the Janjaweed.
Okay, one final question, Dan.
Can we just lift your gaze for a moment from Darfur to broader Africa? In a quarter century since you first went to Africa, what is your sense of trend lines? Are we making progress elsewhere? Is this an isolated example, or is the continent continuing on a downslope that is trouble for all of us?
Okay, Dan Esty was asking about the larger African trajectory, and is it over the last 25 years or so since Dan and I backpacked around Africa together, has it, how does it seem different? And I'd say that in general, it has been consistently pretty depressing. That it's interesting when you talk to development experts, and I spent most of my career in East Asia. And if you talk to people who spend a lot of time in development work in East Asia, they're kind of bubbly and optimistic and enthusiastic. And you talk to, people who've spent their careers in Africa, and it's like, their sense of, it's a struggle to keep anything going. And it's the only region of the world where per capita incomes have declined steadily for decades now. I think that has been particularly exacerbated by AIDS and HIV, that if you hadn't had that happen, I think that a lot of Africa would look much more promising. But, I mean, it's also a reflection of the governance problems that AIDS is so bad in much of Africa. The one thing that I'd say there are a couple of reasons for some slight optimism. One is that I think that African countries now have a much better sense of what policies work. That in the 1960s and even in the 70s, there was a flirtation with sort of planned economies, sort of quasi-socialism, and at that point, it wasn't entirely clear what kind of policies were going to work. Maybe import substitution would work, and now we kind of know that doesn't work, and we have a better sense of the policies that do. You don't overvalue your exchange rate. You try to have economies that are more open to the world. You try to encourage a little more foreign investment and so on. And we do have more African success stories, including some leaders who have done a pretty good job. Botswana now has consistently done just a great job. Mauritius has done a great job. Uganda, Ghana, Rwanda in general, I think have also shown that there can be real successes. Unfortunately, some of the leaders of these places that had looked promising, and Uganda is one good example at the moment, the leaders just stay on. If only President Museveni had had a heart attack 5 years ago, he would be remembered much more fondly. Eritrea is just a country, it's a wonderful country, and it seemed so promising a few years ago when they took power. Instead of putting up a statue of their new president, they put up a statue in the center of town of sandals, because all the revolutionaries had worn sandals. And it's the coolest statue you can imagine. But now their leadership is just turned into real thuggery again. In general, in contrast to almost everywhere in the world, and Latin America would be the only place that sometimes leaves me depressed as well for similar reasons, it's hard to be optimistic, but Africa as a whole. But I do think that, there are some particular countries that have worked it out and that do shine some kind of a light to others about what works. And security in general has improved outside of places like Sudan and Chad. West Africa is in somewhat better shape than it was. It's promising the African Union has been involved to some degree in Darfur, even though it doesn't condemn what's going on in Zimbabwe, for example. So the glass is half full. Thanks very much.